All right, hello, welcome everyone to Star Trek from the Holodeck, Rain Man Digital's exclusive Star Trek fan show, where we discuss, break down, and analyze every episode of Star Trek. If you're new to our shows, you can find all of our shows, past, present, and in the future, pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search from the Holodeck. Give us a thumbs up if you find us on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. All right, so this is the Strange New Worlds edition. We're going to be talking about Season 4, Episode 2, titled The Griffin Incident. Overall, I really liked this episode. One thing Strange New Worlds has consistently done well is embrace genre storytelling, particularly horror. Every season has experimented with a different branch of horror, not simply as an excuse to scare the audience, but as a way of telling distinctly Star Trek stories or even exploring aspects of its characters that another genre might not have been able to do as well. The Griffin Incident continues that tradition. And more importantly, it isn't horror for horror's sake. The horror is doing thematic work. This episode does, in fact, lean heavily into Gothic horror. Rather than relying on monsters or gore, it builds unease through atmosphere, ambiguity, haunted spaces, and of course, psychological dread, which to me is, in fact, the ingredients for proper Gothic horror. And what makes this Gothic horror particularly interesting is that it often anticipates psychoanalysis. It explores the return of the repressed, which is a big part of this episode, unresolved guilt, inherited trauma, anxieties about identity, and the way the past refuses to stay buried. That's exactly what this episode is doing. Everyone aboard the Griffin is, in one way or another, haunted. And of course, I mean our crew that comes on board USS Griffin. Now, Dave,
Yes.
those are my thoughts. What are your initial thoughts on the episode in a nutshell?
I was really excited for this episode because I was reading the synopsis before ever watching it, and I was like, "Okay, Strange New Worlds has done something that I feel is one of their calling cards now to me because a lot of their best episodes are when they delve into the horror genre. Last season, they had 2, which was amazing. They had the zombie episode, which was amazing, and then they had the ghost story one, which was was a different type of horror, but it was still something that was outside the normal Star Trek wheelhouse.
And don't forget about
So
the demon possession.
the demon possession one, yeah. I thought I would never see the demon possession episode and say, "Oh yeah, this is a Star Trek
So
episode."
good.
And here we get like just like what you said, it's a gothic horror story. And this was different than basically like last season's ghost story because this definitely felt more like a stereotypical gothic tale, especially by the time you get to the end because for me the haunting never stops in a gothic horror story. That's the thing that basically fills the dread of any gothic horror story is good guys don't win.
That's a good point, David. How many horror films have we seen, Gothic horror films, where just like how this episode ended with La'an looking out through the viewport and she sees the ghost?
Oh my
I mean,
god, dude,
how
that
many
was
times have we
creepy.
seen a Gothic Victorian age film where the protagonist who thinks they defeated this spirit then looks up towards the higher part of the castle and they see the apparition?
And like not only that is kind of like now this is in my opinion after watching the episode and then seeing it a second time, we discussed about how the last episode was really trying to delve into this philosophical statement about destiny and how you can't avert your destiny. In this episode, I love that basically Kirk and Spock's story was woven into a Gothic horror story where basically in the very end, y- they're this is going to be their destiny.
Yeah.
Kirk Kirk is never going to be with Carol and David. He can't. It's going to haunt him for the rest of his life till, Wrath of Khan, where he makes amends with David. But like with Spock, this actually explains why by the time we get to the original series, why he becomes more Vulcan.
Yeah.
Everyone's been saying, "Well, he's acting way too human. He's too human in Strange New Worlds." We're seeing the seeds now. Basically, he he's being told, or maybe he's being felt by this trauma that basically he has to be more Vulcan.
They're moving the characters that we all are familiar with. They're starting to move them into their places. And I'm glad you spotted that because it seems like by introducing this gothic horror and essentially something called hauntology, you're now able to see the very futures pressing up against our protagonists in a way that is now qualified more as haunting, which is a philosophical method of looking at our current cultural moment. And we'll get into that later in the show because that's one of the reasons why, David, this episode works for me. It's not just one level of the narrative that works. All of it, when you bring it together, works pretty seamlessly, not just within the episode itself, but with the larger whole of Star Trek and what we know of particular characters and their destinies and or fates.
Yeah, and that's why I thought was like super cool in the very beginning when Kirk's the only one that actually hears the baby crying, and I'm like going, "Okay, why is Kirk the only one?" And then as the story goes along, you begin to realize, "Oh, this is after Carol."
Yeah, this is after
So,
Carol, and also his son dies. This is it's haunt. A death that hasn't occurred is already haunting him. That's
he's
the
already
point.
haunting him. Oh
That's
my
the point.
god,
It's
how
more.
gothic is that?
It is dude. That's why. That's why the episode's very strong, dude. All right, so let's just get into all of it. So one thing that's worth mentioning is that this is yet another horror episode written by someone with a horror background. Robbie Thompson is the one that wrote the episode. Previously, he has worked on Supernatural extensively, and Davy Perez also worked at the same time on Supernatural, who, if you're not aware, is pretty much the writer on Strange New Worlds that has written pretty much every Gorn horror-centric episode we have been given. So
Yes.
now we have
Yep.
two Supernatural former writers working together to bring us the horror in ways that we really never expected to see in Star Trek and in ways that are surprisingly working quite well. You can definitely see those influences and affinities towards the horror, and they seem to understand that horror isn't simply about frightening, at its most superficial level. It's about externalizing
Mhm.
psychological conflict in a lot of ways.
And I think that that's what's really impressive about seeing what Davy Perez and now Robbie Thompson has been able to do, jumping from Supernatural into Star Trek. I love what Davy Perez did with the Gorn because he gave it substance. It wasn't just like what you said, "Let's give it shock factor." Oh, the all the, Gorn, bursting from people's chests and body horror and everything. It could have been like a hack job and basically say, "We'll just stick to that stuff." But I give a lot of praise to Davy Perez for giving substance to his horror writing. Much like how Robbie Thompson did in this episode. It's like, yeah, I could actually a writer could have approached this and be told, "I want you to write a gothic horror story in the Star Trek universe." And they could just basically emulate a gothic horror story. But here, Robbie Thompson literally gave meaning and substance to the story.
See, Dave, I like that you bring that up They weren't just, what was the terminology you just used? Emulating?
Yeah, emulating,
Because
copying, or basically stereotyping.
that's what we get a lot of. When you see, let's say, a new writer come into Star Wars and write a Star Wars series, or we see a new writer come into Star Trek, oftentimes it feels like they went and watched a couple movies or a couple shows, and they're now emulating what they saw, and or they're trying to emulate the zeitgeist of Star Trek, essentially, for lack of better phrase. They're emulating what pop culture conveys Star Trek to be, not what it actually is, in fact. And that is a great distinction you made, because this is an example of Robbie Thompson not emulating horror he has seen, but emulating the depth. I don't even want to say emulate. When you understand what something is, you can pretty much shape it out to be however you want. You don't need to emulate
There
as
you
long
go.
as you understand.
Yeah.
And I believe this episode fits that description, Dave. So you are right. It wasn't just simple emulation. It was an understanding of the horror that's being used, as well as um, Star Trek in itself and these
It
characters.
writing was the thing I kept thinking to myself while watching the episode was like, Robbie Thompson does an excellent exercise in one of the most simplistic writing writing exercises that any writer can do.
Hmm.
Ask yourself why. Why are we doing this?
Yes.
And never once in the episode am I leaving a scene where Robbie Thompson is written and saying, "Well, why did that happen?" He explains it through actions
Yeah.
and and what happens in the scene. Okay, this is what's going on.
And what's not explained is left purposely to ambiguity. And that ultimately is really why the episode worked. If they had done a Scooby Doo and reverse engineered the haunting and said by the end of the
Yes.
episode, they're like, well, actually, what it is are just these little alien creatures. Like, yes, it probably would have worked if it was clever enough, but I'm glad that they didn't try to explain it away. The fact that they use
Yes.
negatively charged ions to describe what a ghost is in itself giving you the answer. They are essentially they are ghosts. That is what they are. There is no other way around it. However,
There's
it
no other way
doesn't
around it.
mean that this is some type of metaphysical manifestation. This doesn't validate the existence of some type of theology in the afterlife. If anything, it now brings the phenomenon of ghosts into the realm of science. Perhaps science
Yes.
will answer this. So it is very clever at very different levels.
Oh, yeah, and that's the thing I really appreciate about it too, because by the end of it, it has me more psyched and, leaving myself asking more fun questions
Hmm.
than critical questions.
There you go.
Like, okay, they took the Griffin, right? And they're towing this, and I'm like going, well, they can't get rid of anything that's inside the USS Griffin. What do you do with a ship like that? Do you just destroy it? Put it in a black hole? Something.
That's what
You
I would have
gotta
done.
burn it. Burn it with fire.
Yeah, for real. As soon as
And
I
I'm
saw
like
that
going,
apparition looking back at me, I'm like, fire everything.
fire everything. That's
I,
what I was.
I
I was
would have
like
been
going,
the cowardice Nero, like fire everything.
I know, and I was like, I'm always like cracking up because you brought up, I believe you brought it up in our Unimatrix show about how like Division 12 would be an amazing
Yeah,
sideshow.
yeah. Let's not jump into that yet.
Having
Let's not jump into
Yeah,
that yet.
but having the USS Griffin now in Star Trek canon, and you essentially have this. Essentially, it's the Amityville Horror House in Star Trek,
So
and I'm
good.
like going, automatically, I would be like, I'll put that stupid ship in a black hole, destroy it, blow it up, something, man, burn it.
Yeah.
Basically, you. you have like these fun questions makes me really look at this episode and actually really enjoy it more than
Yeah.
probably a couple people have.
No, I agree. I think all of these things that we've talked about so far is barely the tip of the iceberg, and yet anyone listening can see our enthusiasm and excitement because the episode is well done and it does a lot of things correctly. Number one, is the ambiguity, and we touched on that a moment ago. But just so it's said more formally, I've always enjoyed when Star Trek deals with the unexplained phenomena without immediately explaining everything away. Sometimes there's a scientific answer, sometimes there isn't. But more importantly, those mysteries usually function less as puzzles and more as windows into the characters themselves. And the Griffin Incident continues that tradition in almost every way. Whether these hauntings are supernatural, psychological, or something entirely different becomes secondary. It's not what is important. What matters is what they reveal about the people experiencing them. One thing specifically is this idea of future anxiety. I found this especially interesting because the episode isn't really about memories. It's not what it's about. It's about our memories as viewers, but for the characters, it's
Yes.
about future memories, things that have not happened that could transpire or will transpire. Or more accurately, as I said, future anxieties. Several characters are haunted not by what has happened, but what is destined, or at least appears destined to happen. You have Spock. His vision isn't simply about fear, it's about the lifelong conflict between his Vulcan discipline and his human emotional life. That's something that we have talked about and droned on about for the better part of 10 years now. The haunting forces him to confront that very question that has always defined his character. Can he ever become whole if he suppresses half of who he is? And ironically, what ultimately saves him isn't abandoning logic. It isn't abandoning his Vulcan side. In fact, it was in logic that Spock saved himself ultimately. And this has been a defining conflict for Spock during Strange New Worlds. This is very consistent, very much on par with everything we've seen with Spock outside of Strange New Worlds and within the narrative of Strange New Worlds, which anticipates his more logical characterizations in the original series.
Yeah, and that's the interesting that I'm very interested now where they're going to go with Spock, because up to this point, the past seasons, I know a lot of people have been saying that the representation of Spock in Strange New Worlds is too human
That's the
from,
point.
the betrayal from the original series, and everyone constantly points to that and says, "That doesn't seem right." And I'm like going, "This is the start point where we're going to see the turn now."
Yeah.
Spock has been told up to this point, "You need to be more human. You need to," you have those comedic episodes in the past seasons where he is doing more human things. High five, all that, and all that jazz.
Mhm.
Now he's confronted with the fact that you can't forget the other part of you. So I could see him now, the net for the entire season. Suddenly, maybe he starts thinking, maybe I should actually embrace logic more."
I think, David, that the issue that some may have with, and I think we actually talked about this during our first season discussions, because the stewards of Star Trek chose to retrospectively make the original pilot canon, like officially canon. There were a lot of aspects of Spock's characterization in that pilot that never aired originally in the 60s that portrayed Spock a lot more human than he would actually be portrayed in the official original series after they scrapped that pilot. So what they were attempting to do with this series is have some fun with that bit. Well, he was obviously smiling and laughing in the original pilot. Well, retrospectively, let's just make this feel consistent with what we know of him later in the show. He's someone who, at one point, struggled between the human and the Vulcan side. And as an example of that, we can show that possibly at some point prior to the original series, he might have even put the brakes on the Vulcan side. And we've kind of seen that. He hasn't slammed the brakes on the Vulcan side, but he is in a moment of exploration. He is exploring his human side currently.
I'm interested to see by the end of it, we see the Spock that we all know,
Yes.
which is the Leonard Nimoy representation where he's this logic machine
Yes, David.
that that goes that basically is the parallel to Kirk and McCoy and what drives them crazy, which would be interesting because then you
The
can
foil
really
of McCoy, you should
yeah,
say.
the foil of McCoy, and it's like you can it'll be interesting, and honestly, it's one of the things that I was really worried about because can they really do this? And after this episode, I started thinking about it, I'm like going, "Yeah, they can." Especially we know that McCoy is going to be introduced this season,
No, next season.
and
It's next
oh,
year,
is
I
it
believe.
next season?
Yeah, it's next year.
Okay. So next the next season, we're gonna get McCoy. So, it'll be interesting to actually see where Spock is with his relationship with Kirk at by this point.
Yeah. Well, David, you bring up several good points. You mentioned a few seconds ago that, in some ways, and correct me if I'm wrong if you did not say this, in some ways, this, kind of gestures toward later Spock, later iterations of Spock. One
Yeah.
whose internal anxieties were resolved when, at last, reason allows him to understand that embracing both halves of his identity, not choosing one over the other, is the only logical and coherent solution. That's something that we bring up quite a bit because I believe one of those turning points was in the motion picture itself. That's why we
Yeah.
keep going back and referencing that film because that movie actually really pushes Spock's story forward more than any other character in that movie. And it's all about
Oh, yeah.
pushing Spock from who he was in the original series into how he would eventually be fully characterized in the classic original series movies.
Oh, yeah, and that's the thing that basically I think is something that the current Star Trek writers have to be careful of because, like, we all know by motion picture, the whole turning point for Spock to embrace both of his sides
Is V'ger.
is the motion picture, is V'ger. When he sees the example and says, when he calls V'ger like almost like a distant, a fellow brother or a
Something like
kinship
that.
because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he sees similarities in V'ger trying to find itself and
Understand
what
itself.
was the statement? Understand itself and meet its maker. Seeing now with Spock, with how they're trying to show him as this, it's more embracing the fact that he's trying to still find himself.
Correct.
And I think that's the important part in Strange New Worlds is like people have to understand he's still trying to find himself. He'll
Yeah.
have moments where, oh, he's acting really human. But now, particularly with this episode, you have that reminder for Spock that basically says, "You cannot forget your Vulcan half. You can't you have to remember your logical side because logic will end up saving you
And that
also."
and that's why it's such a it's let me see if I can find the right words for it. It's the reason why I was so satisfied as a Star Trek viewer watching what they did with Spock, because to see that he realized that there is utility purpose to his logic, he was able to be rational enough to bring it back in and use it in order to save himself. So I just think it's an incredibly interesting way to show the different sides of Spock, the internal contradictions of what it's like to be someone of mixed background. It's always been an interesting way to tell a story. Now, moving into Kirk, Kirk's haunting works
Ooh.
differently. He's haunted by a lot of things that kind of made me a little sad
Yes.
because it wasn't
Oh,
just
yeah.
haunting to what it wasn't just gesturing towards David's impending death or his fallout with Carol and his son or the fallout that he will eventually have with his brother and then his brother's death. It also has a lot to do with his own death. His own death. The fact that Kirk's will always die alone in space, I believe is what they said.
Yes. Yeah. Dude, what the hell? How deeply disturbing is that?
Well, that's something
Where
that has always bothered me with what they did with Star Trek Generations, but also because I'm a lover of tragedy, it feels like it's pulling from some of those Greek tragedy influences in order to send Kirk off on this tragic end. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can see the beauty of it retrospectively. However, it's something that's always sat uncomfortably with me because is that really how we want our hero to end? Alone, dying in space on a planet. Like, does that make sense? Alone
is
in space on a planet, dying alone on a deserted planet.
especially since the character of Kirk is this swashbuckling, you know, charismatic, you know, he'll do anything for his crew type captain where he's always smiling. I think the whole point was I remember in Wrath of Khan, he makes the statement that basically he smiles at death and thwarts death and everyone else dies around him. And I'm like going, that what happens in this one is so much deeper than just him dealing with his ongoing issues with Carol and David. It's his impending doom.
It's his whole history.
And no matter what, Kirk is going to march to that doom with a smile and not care. That's the duality of it is like it's tragic, but it also kind of it like really solidifies this fact of Kirk being a stoic type of figure where he might be headed that way, but he's gonna do it smiling.
Yeah,
You know
that's a
what I
good
mean?
point. I don't know if I would prescribe or subscribe. Prescribe stoicism
Probably not stoicism,
to Kirk.
but
However, I get your point. There is a bit of a wink to fate. You know, like a smirk, a wry grin. Oh, I know, fate. You have something in store for me, and I'm ready. And I will
I'm
proceed
ready.
when I'm ready. And like it's
And
he's not afraid. He's very different than Pike. In fact, in a lot of ways, Pike's someone who
exactly.
has an existential angst leading up to his fate. Yes, he's accepted it, but he really hasn't quite accepted. He's accepted it that it must happen, but psychologically, he's not quite there yet. Kirk
He's
is
not
someone
embracing.
who embraces his fate, whether it's ugly or not. I'm like, you know what? If I'm going to go down bloody, I'm going to go down with a smile and I'm going to enjoy the adventure. Like, that is Kirk.
Because you gotta remember one of the tenets of Kirk as a character too is like, what does he always say? "I need my pain. My pain is what makes me."
Yeah.
So, him basically understanding that, yeah, he's not perfect, but he doesn't care because he's going to embrace every single moment that he's got.
Yeah.
That's the difference between him and Pike. Like, Pike to me is like the perfect stoic character where he sees his fate and he's willing to go along with it, but just like what you said, he doesn't embrace it fully.
Yeah.
Kirk is the guy that basically says, "I don't care. I'm going to embrace what I got, and who cares what how it turns out? At least it's the journey that got me there
Yeah.
that counts."
Yeah. That's really the difference between the two, Pike and Kirk for sure. So we find that Kirk is what? Haunted by the echoes of a future, as we had said, fears about George, Sam, fatherhood, isolation, and ultimately dying alone become incredibly poignant because we already know pieces of where his life is headed. The audience experiences dramatic irony. We know.
Yes.
Kirk experiences only anxiety. He feels destiny pressing against him without fully understanding why. Now, Leanne is perhaps the most interesting case because her haunting is different from ours because we're a part of this haunting as well, which is interesting. Unlike Kirk, whose future we largely know, Leanne's future remains unwritten. It's ambiguous. That makes her vision feel less like retrospective tragedy and more like genuine foreshadowing. So the episode
Yes.
then becomes not just an exploration of trauma, but possibility itself. This is the area of Star Trek Strange New Worlds I enjoy the most. It's these characters that we don't know. Yes, I love Kirk, and that will always be one of my favorite components of any Star Trek episode, Star Trek movie, Kirk and Spock, the legacy OG heroes. But because we know their futures, there is always a bit of bittersweet to the stories we're told through Strange New Worlds. With Leanne, this is where possibility opens up. This is where we're like, okay, we don't know anything really about her. There's a giant question mark, and it feels more fun in that regard that we can theorize and wonder how she's going to
Yes.
possibly overcome the coming problem, or will she actually fall to it? Will she
The way I
become an enemy to her friends? I don't know if that's the way to end Star Trek, but that would be very Shakespearean if they do something like that.
the way I see Leanne's story, and it's amazing because when you actually take a look at the 3 individual stories that they told in this episode, what Robbie Thompson did was he told 3 different types of ghost stories in one episode.
Yes.
Kirk's was more of that futuristic dread. We as the audience know his fate, and that builds that, like what you said, that future paranoia. Spock gets more of a introspective dread where he has to question himself. Question question his humanity, question his logic, question his volcanism. With Leanne, I looked at Leanne, and just like you said, there's that possibility. It's truly some of my favorite ghost storytelling moments because it reminds me of like The Shining, where you have like this character that we don't know which way he's going to go because it's so unpredictable. We don't know, will he actually fall to the ghosts, or can he fight his way out? Leanne's like that's the story is whenever the ghost basically keeps telling Leanne, "Oh, you're one of us now." It kept me giving me chills, like watching Jack Torrance in The Shining when he's talking with the ghosts, and the ghosts are telling him, "Oh, Mr. Torrance, you need to be doing this now."
Yeah.
and,
Well,
and,
dude, that was one of the
and
things I liked about the Pike aspect because he was honing those Jack Nicholson vibes, dude, a bit.
yes, just a bit, but it was good. It
Yeah.
was very well done. It wasn't
When he
and it wasn't
started
over
like
the top
cutting his
too, like
fingers, I'm like, oh, okay, this is at another level. This is a whole other level.
this is yeah, but the thing was, it wasn't over the top, and I appreciate everyone's acting performances in this episode too, because they didn't go over the top with anything. Everything was done with this nice
Subtlety.
subtlety that basically made you us as the audience, especially when I was watching, hyper focus on everyone's reactions.
Yeah.
Like when they got to Anson and Anson started acting, just doing the little weird things with his fingers and stuff like that. Those subtleties, when you show it on camera, that makes the audience build dread more. Why is Pike acting like this? That's not normal. It this is how you properly do a a give your audience a feeling of dread that isn't just based on here's this like shock factor, here's this gore moment. You know, yeah, it was very gore. It was very like a shock factor when watching them stab themselves and kill and like people quote unquote dying when they weren't really dying. It was just basically the visions of them doing this. But it was just the little nuances that each of the characters do that basically made you feel more out of sorts.
Yeah. Well, because the emphasis wasn't on like frenetic horror. In a lot of ways, this, again,
Yeah.
Gothic tends to be more psychologically driven, and psychologically driven narratives tend to start becoming more like meditations. And now you bring that all into Star Trek, and what you have is a philosophical meditation in a lot of ways. And that's why there is that much needed subtlety there, because we're reflecting. We need that nuance and that subtle atmosphere to allow everything to breathe so that we can fully comprehend the various levels that are being utilized to shape the episode itself. Now, this actually brings us, Dave, to what I mentioned at the top of the show, hauntology. Now, hauntology is basically another school of philosophical thought. This episode, from the moment we started seeing things with Kirk, that's the first thing that entered my mind was Derrida's idea, Jacques Derrida's idea of um, hauntology, and he coined this term by blending, obviously, haunting with ontology. And his basic argument is actually quite simple, that the present is never simply present. It is always inhabited by ghosts, ghosts of the past, ghosts of unrealized futures. That's the key point for this episode. Ghosts of possibilities, another aspect of this episode that never came to be. Okay? Because there is a sense of anticipation. We hope that Kirk's future is not what it will become, but those possibilities have already been exhausted. We know it, and that's why we're haunted by it. That's the beautiful thing about this conceptual framework known as hauntology, because now you can see things through a different prism. The Griffin incident itself feels like it is, in fact, operating within a very similar conceptual framework. But I also think hauntology doesn't just apply to the episode itself. I think a lot of Strange New Worlds itself is being modeled with this framework. The series is produced today, but populated almost entirely by characters created 60 years ago. This starts to go into what I've been talking about pretty much throughout our entire run of this show. The original series is constantly haunting the present. Every episode carries the weight, essentially, of stories we already know. Every decision, therefore, echoes toward futures we have already seen. Now, there's another
Yes.
element to this. This is actually a book I'm actually in the middle of reading, and it's Mark Fisher's variation of Derrida's hauntology, and it's from a book called Lost Futures. And this is actually a very powerful framework. So Fisher later expands Derrida's concept into something broader culturally. So for Fisher, hauntology describes a society. Okay. Ready for this? A society trapped by lost futures. Instead of imagining radically new possibilities, modern culture continually recycles its own past. That is exactly
Yes.
the definition of today's culture. We're haunted by futures we once imagined but never achieved. Now let's bring Star Trek into this. In many ways, contemporary Star Trek has struggled with exactly this problem and it has become or often become preoccupied with revisiting older eras, older characters, and older stories. So rather than imagining tomorrow, it spent much of its time remembering yesterday.
Yes. An example of this, I just actually read about this, and this is actually a good example for people who want to really understand what we're talking about. There's an example that I found that basically was given, and it says, an example of lost futures is something like this. If you were given a trinket by your husband before he went to war and he never returned, the trinket would come to represent your husband
Mm-hmm.
and the lost future you once shared. This is an elementary example of hauntology. So, like, going to what you were saying is like how people look at nostalgia. Like, we are constantly haunted by the fact that we connect our memories to this particular thing. So that particular thing, in essence, represents everything
Yes.
of that.
Now take that example and apply it to our life. Okay. The reason why we keep going back to things, according to Fisher, using Derrida's framework, is because we're haunted by things that never came to fruition. And because we have become haunted by things that have never come to be, we are stuck reimagining those very promises that never happened. That's why we're never progressing and envisioning new futures. Why is it every future is dystopian and dark in sci-fi? Why is it when we do get something
Exactly.
upbeat,
Yes.
why is it when things are upbeat, it kind of harkens back to a type of conservative past? You know, Star Trek is approaching that very moment as well. The reason why Star Trek, for a lot of us, is starting to feel depressing at times is because Star Trek was originally conceived in the 60s. It had this idea of a future, this optimistic future that would change everything. Man would be different. The very conditions of humanity would change humanity for the better. We would do away with the scarcity of life. We would enter into a post scarce world and we would explore strange new worlds and seek out new life and new civilizations. But as time has marched further and further away from that original concept as devised in the late 60s, we realize that that future is incredibly unlikely.
Yes.
And now Star
And it
Trek
becomes
becomes
even
trapped in its own haunting. Therefore, hauntology
yes.
helps you understand what Star Trek is currently going through from a creative standpoint. That is why I do suggest if you can tolerate philosophical reading, I would actually suggest people pick up the book. It's actually incredibly enlightening.
It is. I mean, like, the way that this works, it really helps people understand a lot of maybe their questions that they have why nowadays a lot of people are turned off by like nostalgia and
They
everything
say
like
they
that. And
are,
they're
David.
always
They say they are, but they also want that safety because it reminds them of a hope.
yeah, yeah. It reminds them. And that's the thing is like it once you actually start studying stuff like this, you begin to actually understand how your brain as a human might work.
Well, that's the
And
beautiful thing about philosophy, right?
exactly. And this is actually one of the first things that I ever not wrote, but actually read about was because I wanted to understand why the heck do why is it it actually started as a really cool question because, like, I started noticing in a lot of movies that we love, that people seem to get bothered when you watch an old movie, like, say, it's from the 1960s, and suddenly they say, "In the world, 1999, this happens. We have flying cars. We we have hologram skateboards that we ride," right? And 1999 comes around, we don't have that. And I started actually thinking to myself, I was like, "Man, a lot of people, like, start hating those movies when they used to love them." Well, why is that? Because in a way, we all are being affected by hauntology. We see the lost we see the lost possibilities of the future.
Or the manifestations of a phenomena that can be described through hauntology, I guess would probably be the
Yes.
better way of saying that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, David. So let's talk a bit about Division 12.
Oh, man.
Now, because things seem to be stuck in the past, right? That's something we talk about all the time in Star Trek. And now we're literally specifically talking about conceptual framework that has everything to do with that. And that's the reason why, David, I am incredibly happy with this new idea of Division 12. It's something new. And that was probably ultimately, at the end of the day, despite everything I liked about this episode, Division 12 is probably my favorite part of the episode. This feels genuinely new. A Starfleet division dedicated to investigating unexplained phenomena opens an entirely fresh corner of the universe. We're talking, Star Trek X Files, essentially. What can
Yes.
you not do with a concept like that? Think about all of the ambiguities in various episodes, hundreds of episodes across Star Trek's history. And imagine if a Division 12 series, yes, I am jumping ahead.
You're you're getting to the possibilities, Mike. They might be lost futures.
Yeah. Um, but these are the types of ideas, David, that make for good shows. Starfleet Academy, I don't want to get in negative territory, but one reason why, one, okay? So don't throw tomatoes at me and say there's 75 reasons. I understand, okay? I'm anticipating my own future here. I'm going to be blasted for even mentioning Starfleet Academy. There's a reason, one reason, why Starfleet Academy doesn't work. Expectations. We immediately have an idea of Starfleet Academy and what it should do and what it should be. Division 12, what? That can be anything. The concept is cool, the idea, but that can actually turn into be anything. And it would work because it would work against our expectations because there would be no immediate expectations other than this is a new Star Trek series. This is the
Yes.
benefit of
And
utilizing new concepts.
and also it sticks with the core theme of Star Trek in itself, exploring strange new worlds and strange possibilities.
There you go. This fits
So,
right
like,
into the vision of OG Trek.
and that's the thing that when I thought about it, a Division 12 series should it should be like this really cool concept of Star Trek and still carry its Star Trek bones where it's like the whole point of Star Trek is to actually explore strange new worlds and strange, alien races and try to
You mean
figure out the answers
superficially, right? The
superficially,
mission
right?
of Federation Starfleet. Yeah.
Yes, the superficially fit the Federation, but you could do so many different types of storytelling, and up to this point, they've proven you can do horror storytelling in Star Trek now. I mean, I would give a Division 12 series over to Robbie Thompson and David Perez. and say, "Okay, guys, go for it.
Action.
Give us action. Don't just give us an episode. You don't have to write just an episode. Write us an entire season now."
Yeah. I don't know if Robbie Thompson can show run. He did show run the Winchester spinoff, and that was
Let's you know what? We learn from our
but
mistakes.
but that
Learn
but that is not to say he isn't a good writer. He is. But
Yeah.
that's a distinction that should be made. You can be a good writer and not be a good leader, which is essentially what the show running position is a leadership role. So, all right. So,
Yeah.
Division 12, David, it reminds me of how the Next Generation casually introduced the Cardassians and Bajor. They didn't really expand on this idea. They didn't express everything it would be, but they introduced it very casually, nonchalant, like we may or may not ever see it again. But those ideas were not immediately exhausted. That's the point. They were allowed to develop over years before eventually becoming, foundational to Deep Space Nine, Voyager, via the Maquis storyline. That's how good world building actually functions, how it works. You introduce ideas, you let them breathe, then you build upon them. And Division 12 feels like it has that kind of potential. So,
Yeah, I
I mean, do you
definitely
agree? I
agree
mean,
with
there is
that.
that danger, David. I mean, Section 12 presented all types of ideas, and I still believe that could work. They just chose to give us a half-assed movie instead of a well thought out
Yes.
philosophical Star Trek series.
Yeah, they decided to give us a superficial bang bang, essentially a heist film.
Yeah, yeah,
And unfortunately, that is an example of like not understanding the series that you're writing for. Like the difference between that and what we get in this episode is like it goes back to like what I mentioned earlier in our talk where it's like Robbie Thompson understood the assignment. Give us a gothic story, give us a gothic ghost story, but don't forget you're doing this for Star Trek.
right,
When you look at something like Section 31 and you like go, "Man, what happened?" It's almost as if they said, "Here, give us a heist film minus the Star Trek."
right. Yeah. Well,
Forget about the Star Trek.
yeah, float some ideas like Division 12, but don't shit them out.
Don't shit them out.
Yeah. So,
Don't have don't have, like, bad lettuce and give us diarrhea, you know?
yeah. Oh, man. Yeah, so I guess my point is rather than endlessly revisiting, familiar concepts, Division 12 feels something uniquely associated with this era of Star Trek. And this era of Star Trek needs something that feels like its own because a lot of what Kurtzman has done, and this isn't a negative, a lot of Kurtzman era Star Trek retrospectively, it's even being written this way already in terms of scholarship, academics. It's already being viewed as less than trailblazing and more franchise maintenance. So that's pretty much what Kurtzman's legacy is already being built as. It's not about blazing new trails. It's about, hey, I'm going to keep this alive. And I'm going to do this and this in
Yeah.
order to keep it alive, to maintain the franchise. So this is something that does more than just maintenance. This is something that actually introduces something uniquely Kurtzman era. Like this is something that you can point to and say, this is something really cool that the Kurtzman era introduced, just like the Deep Space Nine era introduced, section 31. If
Yeah.
Kurtzman's era wants to leave a lasting legacy, I think ideas like Division 12 are far more valuable than simply revisiting another legacy villain. New ideas are almost always exciting than imperfect recreations of old ones. Let's
And that's
bypass our own expectations, knowing that the Kurtzman era cannot capitalize on what came before and do it just as well. So why try to do something that you're not doing as well and do your own thing? Okay, I know some people are already saying, Michael, he is doing his own thing. You really want to push him into that further? What I mean by that is, yes, Kurtzman is putting his own creative spin on things, but the things he's spinning are things he never created. And that, I think, is a large part of the problem. If he was just creating things, there would be far less toxicity, in my opinion, because then we can point and say, well, I don't really like the story, rather than, oh my God, you're ruining canon. Oh my God, you're ruining what we thought we understood. Oh my God, you're ruining, ships and people and events and circumstances and situations. That's why I say bypass it all. Bypass it all so that we can evaluate what you do strictly on your own merits.
That's the thing, and I honestly think that looking at what is in front of us, you know, hauntology again,
Yeah.
looking what's in front of us for the future of Star Trek, it's very unknown right now because if you think about it, after Strange New Worlds finishes up, what else do we got left, Mike? We got Starfleet Academy season 2. We know that it's not getting a season 3. Know that it's not. It's dead. So after that,
I'm not even going to mention the name, David, because it's been proven that every time someone says the name Star Trek Starfleet Academy, a fanboy falls down and dies. It's true.
it just drops dead. But like but Star Trek Kurtzman, you're right, needs to actually find something that will continue if he's wanting to continue and manage the ship as it were. He needs more things out there to get people interested. And going back to the well is honestly, your well's gonna dry up sooner or later. An example of this in geek culture is like look for people out there, Doctor Who. Doctor Who, the problem with Doctor Who is it lived and breathed for so long that it didn't want to introduce anything new. So now when you look at the past Doctor Who seasons, people just immediately point to it as they're just rehashing things. They're just bringing back old villains, recycling old stories. There's nothing new. And Star Trek, if Kurtzman's not careful, he could be like that, where it's kinda like, "Well, I'm just gonna basically do what? Reboot the original series and have, like, these new actors portray the classic characters?" It might work, but it also might blow up in your face because people will just get tired of it.
Yeah.
You bring in something like Division 12, "Oh, okay, this is something new." You can bring in new actors, new characters, and you could still use old concepts, but, like, getting a chance to tell stories in your universe in a different vein is very important. That's why, at the beginning of our recording, it really one of the biggest things that I wrote in my notes was, like, this is another example of why Strange New Worlds, one of their calling cards is the fact that they were willing to jump genres and show that Star Trek, quote unquote, can be told in different storytelling methods and work.
Yeah. So what's your percentage?
I I actually am again gonna copy my score from last week, I believe, or the last episode is a 95. I really liked this episode, dude. I thought they did a fantastic job with it. I like all of the episodes that Strange New Worlds has done in the horror genre up to this point. And I'm really happy that we got this episode early in the season, because if you think about it, some of the episodes that they in the past seasons have been, like, smack dab in the center of the season. It's like, "Okay, now we get this breath of fresh air." They
Yeah.
continued the trend of a strong episode from last episode into this episode.
Yeah. Well, just
So
just remember even though I have enjoyed most of Strange New Worlds, the last season, season 3, had a very strong start and then faltered for about
Yeah.
4,
Yeah.
maybe 3 episodes, and then picked itself back up by the end. So we still have a few more episodes before we can say, okay, this season feels like it's stronger than the past. But that's not to say any season is incredibly weak by any means. And just to kind of follow you up, David, I think what I appreciated the most about the episode is how it ultimately doesn't choose between reason and mystery. It allows it to breathe, allows the ambiguity to marinate, because in doing so, the universe remains vast. That's something that we need to remember. We're exploring a universe, and there's going to be things that are unexplainable. If science cannot explain things, they can describe things, but not explain certain things, then why would it change in 3 or 400 years? Science, in a lot of ways, helps us interpret the thing in itself, the thing that we can never really truly come in contact with. It doesn't bring us into contact. It describes what we may see. So Star Trek going down this more ambiguous route, and for there to be things that are scientifically unproven or things that science can't describe, isn't throwing a middle finger at Star Trek's science underpinnings. If anything, it's challenging science and saying, hey, there are things that we still don't know about the cosmic universe. And that's why I felt like this episode was also strong. It reminds us that there are things that even science may have difficulty explaining. Division 12 itself exists because there are still things Starfleet doesn't understand. And as Pike says near the end, space is limitless. So whatever they encountered, it's still out there, which is cool. And I think that's exactly where Star Trek is at its best. Not when it provides clear answers, but when it reminds us there are still mysteries worth exploring. So 95% as well, David. Incredibly strong episode. I am very happy with it. That does bring us to the end of our discussions. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.